Hey everyone, we're going to be looking at chapter 18 here. We're going to look at scientific revolution, enlightenment, let's see what else, philosophy a little bit, and yeah, that's mostly what we're going to be looking at here. Scientific revolution, enlightenment, consumer economy in the 16th to the 18th century. So from 1540 to 1790 there. So we'll go ahead and get started on this. Let's see, scientific revolution. All right. So scientific thought through the early 1500s, old to new. Natural philosophy. So the scientific revolution lasted from about 1540 to 1690, where we see the old world sort of morph into the new world of science and reason. Natural philosophy is the term we really use for this time period. That's what they would have called science. What we consider science today, they called natural philosophy. Sort of a precursor to our modern science. It focused on questions of nature, the universe, its purpose, its function. Certainly really what we consider science today. Natural philosophy was based on the ideas of ancient philosophical thinkers such as Aristotle from the 4th century BCE. So that was about 2,000 years before this, give or take. And Ptolemy from the 2nd century CE. So that was about 1,300 years before this time period. However, Aristotle's ideas have evolved over the years and had evolved over the years, in large part to theologians bringing together Christian ideas with rational thinking. A theologian, that's a religious, basically a religious scholar, or is a theologian. And much of thought in this time period, science or natural philosophy, came out as an outgrowth of church and church scholarship. Because for many centuries, the only authority in Europe which actually supported education and science and technology, such as it was the church. It's ironic in a way, considering when you get to this time period, the church is very, very resistant to a lot of this new science. And yet, for centuries, the only real advancements were done in universities, which were often created and paid for by the church. Yeah. So anyway, some of these changes we see happening here, the idea of the crystal spheres, as you see in this image down here, and the idea of heaven, the earth as a center of the universe, and the idea that these crystal spheres held all the planets and the sun, which, of course, in this time period, there was still a very strong belief that the universe all revolved around the earth. The earth was the center of the universe, the center of everything. And even the sun revolved around us, everything else. And all of these spheres were situated and created by God. And the heavens were outside of these spheres. And Ptolemy, years later, Ptolemy was the one who actually came up with the idea that maybe actually the planets revolved around us, even though it was still a thought that we were the center of everything. Origins of scientific revolution. All right, so study of ancient texts in medieval universities, and the existence of universities in the first place was primarily really which fosters this scientific revolution. Many of these ancient texts were translated from Arabic. It should be noted that much of the earliest actual science, as we think of as a science, was actually done by Arabic scholars. All through the medieval Dark Ages, the year 800 to year 1200, something like that, the real scientific advancement that was done was Arabic universities, Middle East universities. They were far more advanced than anything happening in Europe. In the Muslim world was far more advanced than anything happened in the Christian world. Often in Arabic print, so it had to be translated. Often had to be triple translated, double, triple, however you want to put it, from Arabic to Greek, and then from Greek into whatever the European languages were, whether it was Latin or Italian or French or English, Spanish, whatever, German. But it often had to go from Arabic to Greek to another European language. These topics often include mathematics, they included astronomy, things like that. So the scientific progress was then further stimulated in the Renaissance era, which you get closer to like the 12, 13, 1400s, which is the Renaissance in Europe, where there was so much connection between Europe and the Middle East. Pretty much Europeans learned a lot of this information over the trade routes, the Silk Roads, things like this, and we see science, sort of the center of science and learning, sort of transfer into Europe by the 13, 14, 1500s. As Europe becomes more advanced and the Arabic world sort of stagnates. So Renaissance artists turned, towards realism, realistic art, because art was, of course, key to Renaissance. We see geometry to present three-dimensional images and perspective. We see voyages of exploration across the world, studying of the skies, the stars for navigation. We see scientific questions about the world being answered, people exploring and finding out new places, new locations, telescope, the thermometer, things like this, and of course, lots of other technologies. Printing press, gunpowder, you name it, things like that, which all came from the East, all came from the Middle East, all came from China. The reality is, almost all scientific advancements that really began the scientific revolution in Europe, all of it was kickstarted by Asian advancements, which had happened decades, centuries earlier. And Europeans learned about it, borrowed it, and then improved upon it. Okay, the Copernican hypothesis. Copernicus up there, a little picture of Copernicus. All these images you see on these slides are all images of they all directly relate to the slide. They're images, paintings, sketches, drawings of the actual people who are talked about on the slides here. Nicholas Copernicus, he studied astronomy, medicine, church law at the University of Krakow. He focused his attention on the flaws in Ptolemy's work, built off of Ptolemy and found mistakes in Ptolemy, or mistakes may not be the right word. Ptolemy did the best he could at his time period. It's simply Ptolemy, you're limited. Like when your ancient peoples were limited by the technology. They could only learn or find out so much. So a lot of it's simply taking what they did and expanding upon it and growing it and making it much more detailed and much better explained and understood. The one thing they were really careful, and this is a key issue in the scientific revolution, is most of these scientists, these natural philosophers, they tried to explain science and reason and the universe while simultaneously, most of them, not questioning God. They tried to find a way to line up science and the explanation of the heavens and the movement of the stars and the planets while simultaneously, either saying, well, God created all this and did all of it, or sort of ignoring God. But rarely ever did people directly challenge God, because if you did that, you would immediately have the church after you, and the church would destroy you. So you had to walk the line of science, reason, technology, while not offending the religious part of society, which was difficult considering religion was part and parcel of every part of life in this time period. Copernicus developed the argument that the sun was the center of the universe. He was the first one to come up with this image here on the right, the idea that the sun was actually the center. But yes, the center of the universe. Still, Earth-centered. It's the sun is the center of everything, the entire existence. This was an idea probably borrowed from the Greeks. The Greeks were the first ones to really talk about this and the idea of this, millennia before this, but yet then when the Christian church got a hold of it, they sort of shifted it back to the earth being the center of everything. Of course, God creating earth or whatnot. He spent 30 years working on this. His argument identifies the Copernican hypothesis, as it says at the top there, and he didn't publish his book, his manuscript on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. He didn't publish it during his life. He was afraid to, because he believed it basically challenged that we were the center of everything, and it challenged the long-held belief that the earth was the center of everything, and he believed he would be ruined. Him and his family would be ruined or destroyed by the church, the Catholic Church, so it didn't actually get published until after his death, which he probably was right. Now, both Protestant and Catholics really had a problem with this. Many people condemned it, many argued it completely conflicted with all the biblical scriptures, as exactly he predicted. He believed it would really cause an uproar, and it's exactly what it did. But it does get out there finally. Copies of it are made. It is distributed. And, of course, we come to understand that it is true. The sun is the center of at least our solar system, and we all revolve around it. All right, proving Copernicus right. Now, Brahe, he studied a new star, a supernova, the first recorded, not recorded, but the first studied. There have been recordings of supernova going back to the Egyptians. They, of course, didn't know what it was back then, but they're recording and actually studying of the supernova in 1572. He established 2 observatories with royal support. He compiled massive data in the Rudolphine tables about the motions of the planets. Basically, just charts and figures and hundreds of pages of these charts and figures, which were compiled into this Rudolphine tables, 1572. Extended on to this, the next one. Johann Kepler, he began to rework Tycho Brahe's work, looking at Brahe and looking at Copernicus's work. And this is really how it works. Each scientist in the next generation basically builds off the previous scientists, taking their information and expanding it, explaining it in further detail, refining it, maybe even proving some things right or wrong. That's the way it works. It's like a pyramid. They just keep going up and up and up, each time advancing beyond what the previous scientists did. Kepler was able to mathematically prove the Copernican hypothesis using Brahe's data and his own observations of the planets and the stars. He demonstrated that the planets did indeed move around the sun. He did this mathematically. And when it was finally released and the data was released, no one could disprove it. Mathematically, it was unable to be disproven. We're showing planets revolved around the sun and that they also change speeds. Also realizing that they actually changed speeds. The closer they were to the sun, the faster they went, and the further away they got, because, of course, he also was able to conclude that they were not. We know the planets don't rotate around the sun in a perfect circle. It's actually an ellipse. It's more of an oval. All the planets revolve around the sun in some version of an oval. And the reason that is when you get closer to the sun, because of its gravity, you're pulled closer, and you actually move faster. And then when you get further away, you move slower. And the further away you get, of course, the gravity is less, so the planets will pull out a little further. Of course, they're always still brought back, and then it's the way it works. And he was able to prove all this mathematically, using experiments and things like that. Then you have Galileo, who might be, some of you may not, he may be the one you've heard of. Most people have heard of Galileo. He worked on this, he elaborated on it, he consolidated using the experimental method. This might be the first real documented experimental method. Scientists have been using it for years before this. But he wasn't interested in speculation, what might happen, what should happen. He basically did experiments to actually determine exactly what was happening, which is how science now works. You hypothesize, but then you use the experimental method to actually prove what's real and what isn't. His most famous experiments resulted in Galileo's laws of inertia, a fundamental building block of physics and science. He argued that the actual natural state of all objects is motion, not rest, which was thought before. The natural state of objects is motion. Objects are continuously in motion until stopped by an external force. Friction or gravity. Like you roll a ball across a table and it stops. Okay, it stops. It stops because of friction and the gravity pulling it down. If there was no friction, it was a completely frictionless surface and there was no gravity, that ball would never stop. The natural state of objects and atoms and molecules, as they will find out later, is a constant state of motion. Unless some sort of external force acts upon an object, it will never stop moving. He built his own telescope. He built his own telescope. He discovered 4 of Jupiter's moons. There's a lot more. There's like 20-something we know today. He began to pioneer the scientific critical thinking, where scholars rely on observable evidence and not past authorities or speculation. He is, some would consider him the father of modern science, although it should be made clear from this, everything he did was built on all the previous scientists. All in a chain, all connected, all significant, each one only able to accomplish what they did because of the previous work done by previous scientists. Okay, so Newton's synthesis, Isaac Newton. Oh, make sure did I miss something here? Oh, no, there we go. All right, so most scientists accepted Kepler and Galileo by the mid-1600s, natural philosophers. Now, Sir Isaac Newton, he accepted the Copernican hypothesis as well, but he wanted to know the forces. He accepted that he believed it was real, that what he was talking about, there was these outside forces that was actually causing things to move and to speed up and slow down, and he believed all of it. All the math checked out, I guess. You know, I'm not a scientist, but I guess the math checked out. But he wanted to know exactly why. He believed the math made sense, but he wanted to know why. And so he wanted to know what were the actual forces. He dedicated his life to understanding and studying these advanced mathematics and physics, to put everything together, to sort of compile these theories together, and eventually he creates what's called the Principia, which, of the scientific period, it is the most comprehensive set of, in its volumes. It's not one, it's like multiple books. Basically, it is the most comprehensive set of literature on the scientific principles that was ever compiled until modern times. This huge work that was pretty much his whole lifetime putting it together. Mathematical principles, philosophy, physics. They didn't use the term physics back then, but that's really a lot of it was principles of physics. He developed this argument, his law of universal gravitation, that all objects are attracted to each other. One thing that's really great about Newton's work is it's all been shown. He couldn't prove all of it. He couldn't actually definitively prove everything. He just simply didn't have the technology available, but it's all been proven true. With the exception of quantum mechanics, which quantum mechanics, we're not even going to get into discussing that, but the normal rules don't apply when you're talking about quantum mechanics. But that's not something we'll probably ever talk about. We won't ever talk about that in this class. So, Bacon, Descartes, scientific method. Improving the scientific method was determined to be the way of obtaining better and better understanding and more precise knowledge. So more detailed, more experiment, and the more you experiment, the more your knowledge becomes precise, exact. Francis Bacon's theory of inductive reasoning, known as empiricism, his theory of inductive reasoning we call empiricism, demanded that evidence be gathered through observation, experimentation, rather than speculation. You must observe and you must experiment to actually find out reality, to find out what is really happening. And René Descartes came along. His important contributions, however, was this idea of Cartesian dualism. Probably the most significant. All these are well-known mathematicians, and they're all OGs, if you will, of mathematics, if you study mathematics. His most significant was probably this idea of Cartesian dualism. It posited that the world consists of two fundamental entities, that the world consisted of matter and mind, the physical and the spiritual. These are the two things, matter, physical, and mind, spiritual. And he was able to, at least for this time period, he reconciled the ideas of religion and science. The physical, matter, and the spiritual, mind. Science, matter, physical, and the spiritual, religion, mind, and spiritual here. In essence, what he was saying was humans are given the ability to understand the physical world by God. So the simplest way you could say is the only reason these scientists are able to do all these things, the only reason the scientists are able to come up with all these theories is because God gave us the power to do it. And thereby extension, because our ability to reason and use logic and use our mind is a God-given power, God-given ability. God wouldn't have given it to us if we weren't supposed to use it and come up with these things. So, therefore, the things that we conclude and the scientific discoveries we find, therefore, must be somehow sanctioned by God and associated with God, because God gave us the powers to do this. This was sort of part of this idea of somehow being able to form this side-by-side connection between the physical science and reason and logic and religion, the secular and the sacred world together somehow. Descartes also used deductive reasoning to structure the Cartesian dualism. Deductive reasoning is a process of moving from general to specific truths, making general hypotheses and deducing very specific solutions or answers from observation. Sherlock Holmes, he deduced. He was able to look at all the different things around. Sherlock Holmes, again, it's fiction or whatever, but he would be able to walk into a room and look at all the different things in the room and deduce what happened. From all the different general evidence, he could tell you exactly, specifically who was there, who was killed, who did this, who did that. Deductive reasoning. It's interesting. It's an interesting way of doing it. Deductive and inductive reasoning, sort of two different directions to look at coming to a final solution. All right, let's look at medicine. So, all these new scientific interests in the cosmos also had a new interest in the microcosm. The cosmos being the big, the microcosm being the very small. Same way we're using the lenses and the lenses to use telescopes to see off into the sky to magnify things from far away, they learned how to use microscopes to magnify very, very small things to make them much bigger to see it. Interest in the human body and medicine. Paracelsus. Paracelsus supported the experimental method in medicine. He pioneered the use of drugs to address chemical imbalances. Most of these folks wrote books as well, scholarly books and journals. So using drugs to basically treat them, the imbalances they called them, today illnesses, the illnesses in the human body. They had a real belief back then that if there's anything wrong with your body, it was often referred to as a humor. There were different humors in your body, so if you were sick or didn't feel well, there'd be different types of humors that were associated with the elements. Sort of like alchemy kind of stuff, not real science. Yet the thing is, there is some science to it. I mean, we know many drugs that we use today that are truly proven drugs to help us with illnesses come from plants. So, there's medicinal things, whatnot. So there's definitely some reality there. Andreas Vesalius, he studied anatomy. I could never do this, what he did. He dissected bodies. He basically spent his entire career dissecting dead bodies. And he detailed charts, like just hundreds of images, perfectly detailed charts of veins and organs and muscles, things like this. Pretty crazy. You'd have to be, not crazy, but you have to be a kind of person who can do that and dissect bodies and stuff. Not for me. But what's really interesting is Vesalius' charts and his books were used for the next 300 years. So doctors were still studying Vesalius' drawings and sketches of the inner human body, the actual inner parts of the human body, for centuries after he was gone. That's how impactful his work was. Robert Boyle, chemistry. He established a study of chemistry as an actual science. Now, this is not alchemy, even though alchemy and chemistry might seem similar, and maybe chemistry sort of is an outgrowth of alchemy. But chemistry is real science. Elements of nature were constructed of small atoms. He's one of the first people to come up with this idea of an atom, this really, really, really minuscule microscopic part of all matter. He undertook experiments as well to try and prove these theories. All right, what impact did this have on society in general? Really controversial stuff. You got to consider we have a world in this time period in Europe that is almost everything is explained through church and religion and God. Many of these scientists challenged those theories. Even though many scientists were careful to not explicitly denounce God or the church or religion, many of their theories were often sort of controversial, or they didn't really mesh with the idea of religious belief. So a lot of their stuff was controversial. Lots of great results. Of course, lots of great results. new groups, new international community, new competitions, journals, societies, universities and schools. We see an increasing interest in science and technology, and the idea to make new discoveries, very inspiring to generations of people. Also had a lot of, today we know science is incredibly significant regarding technology and advancements of our government and our society, but it was that way back then too. Governments would finance it. National academies of science were established, state-sponsored all across Europe, things like that. It did have a very limiting effect for women. Women were mostly prevented from any of this stuff. Women were largely prevented from having any education. You didn't have women lawyers, women doctors, women professors. Almost everything having to do with education was limited exclusively to men. Now, there's exceptions. There's always exceptions. But the 99% plus of people who got any type of advanced education, who would have access to these academies, or these universities, or education, or to be scientists, was all men. Rarely did women get involved in this stuff. Not a lot of women were interested, but there were even of the women who were interested, they simply weren't allowed. They simply weren't given the opportunity. They were prohibited from doing it. Religion versus science and secular states. Now, Western religious authorities often oppose these theories because, again, much of these theories didn't leave room for God. Even if the scientists were careful not to explicitly say it, much of it was implied. Much of it challenged religious scripture, religious thought, and so therefore didn't leave room for God. Now, states that lacked strong religious authority were much more pro-science. For instance, England and Netherlands. Countries that were not very, very beholden to the Catholic Church, Protestants were more open. The core belief in many Protestant groups was the idea of reason and logic. And so the science was sort of an extension of that. I'm not saying they all agreed with it, but in Catholic areas, though, which was still most of Europe was still under Catholic authority, very little acceptance. Matter of fact, people would be killed. Sometimes people would be killed for challenging traditional religious belief, which at this point in time had been pretty well established for well over a millennia. Long freaking time. Yeah, long time. All right, let's shift gears a little bit to the actual philosophy part. Not the natural philosophy, but the real philosophy. The Enlightenment in thinking. All right, the emergence of the Enlightenment. All right, out of the scientific revolution really grows this Enlightenment. The evolution of this period is sort of as follows. Okay. Medieval and Reformation, Reformation being the people who reformed the church, they believed in sin and salvation. Pretty much all humans fell in cat. You were sinners, you came to God, you were saved. But the basis of all humanity was sin. We were all sinful. All right. Sin and salvation, that's really what matters. All right, now Renaissance thinkers, they were often referred to as humanists, Renaissance humanists. And why they're called humanists is a little different because Renaissance humanists focused on the human, not the spiritual. That's why they're referred to as humanists. They really focused more on the importance of life was the human self, not as much the spiritual self. More of the mortal realm, not the spiritual realm. Again, they still didn't completely discount religion. That's a surefire way to get yourself thrown in prison or burned at the stake. That happened. But they still said it was more focused on humanity, humanists. They focused on art, literature, and other worldly matters. Again, things we actually create. Art, literature, sculpture, human creation, human power of creation, not God's power of creation. Then comes Enlightenment, where thinkers believed that in their era they could actually produce fresh intellectual thought and intellectual ideas. And they did this through three primary means. Using reason, rational, secular thought. Secular, the term secular means non-religious. So reasonable, rational, secular thought. And then further, using the scientific method to discover universal laws of the world. So you take reasonable, secular, rational thought, non-religious thought, put that together with actual science and reason, experimental method, as we just talked about in the previous sections, and you create universal laws of the world and space and matter and gravity. You put those together, actual hard laws and study and research and experimentation with reasonable intellectual thought, and what you get is progress. What does progress give us? The idea is progress should give us better people, better lives, better society, better government. It is the basis of the political idea we have in modern society called progressive. Being progressive, which is usually more aligned with like liberal left thinking. The idea of being progressive, progress, making life better for everyone, society better for everyone, government better for everyone, better laws and policies for everyone. That's the idea of progress. And so reasonable thought with actual facts and figures and actual real data, and you get progress. That's the way it should work. That's their idea behind it, and that's how they basically tried to sell this, try to sell these ideas. All right. Pierre Bayle, he wrote the Historical and Critical Dictionary, and he established a view known as skepticism. This view of skepticism. The basis for skeptical thought was the idea that nothing can ever truly be known. Nothing can ever truly be known beyond all doubt, especially concerning religion. It's very interesting how skepticism, some would have used this as a criticism of science, but that was often sort of glossed over because you could use proof in scientific theory and reason and experimentation to prove most things. But where skepticism becomes most used and most controversial is, how can you prove God? How can you prove faith? How can you prove religion? Inherently, you can't. Inherently, the core principle of religion, which makes religion work, is faith. You have to believe the unbelievable or believe the unprovable. You simply have to believe. And skepticism became a popular idea, especially with the rise of the scientific revolution, because you can't. Religion is, almost by its definition, unprovable. You have to take it on faith. John Locke, Essay Concerning Human Understanding. This is one of the most influential texts of the Enlightenment. Locke argued, that all ideas were derived from experience. Everything we know and learn and the way we are and who we are is from experience. Basically, at birth, the human mind is a blank slate, tabula rasa, a blank slate. And that's a term from old because that's how in the original universities, that's how they did all their work. They had slate, which was like a black metal or black rock, I guess, and they would write on it with chalk, and they would do their lessons, and then wipe it off, and it would be a blank slate, so they could do the rest of their lessons. So the idea that the human mind's a blank slate, a blank tablet, on which beliefs and understanding are written by your environment, and your environment is your education, your social institutions. In essence, society determines who you are. Society determines what you're going to be. So you take two identical people born at the same time, in the same place, and you put one living a life as a peasant, and you put one living a life in a noble family, and they might have been born as brothers, genetically brothers, twins. But you put them in two different worlds from the moment they're born and raise them, and after 20 years, they're different people. Different ideas, different values, different morality, different education. They've lived entirely different lives, loved different people. They are different. Genetically identical, but in every way, every other way that matters, socially, they're different people. And he argued that that was actually the way it was. Now, why is that so important? Because his argument can be further expanded upon to say how our society grows and how we teach people and how they become constructive members of society, whether they're successful or they create good societies or bad societies, whether they're good or bad or good or evil. It's based upon us, the laws we make, the rules we make, the way they're educated, the way they're trained, the way they're raised. It's an argument that simply says the way we raise our children is what our society will become. If we assume they're a blank slate at the beginning, then how we raise them will determine what our society is, and who they are, and what kind of people they are, and what type of government and society they create when they're adults. That is an argument for the scientific revolution. Because if everyone is educated, prepared, goes to school, gets an education, understands reason and logic and how the world works and how society works and how the universe works, we'll all be better people for a better society. Anyway, that's sort of how the argument goes. All right, the influence of the philosophes. Now, many intellectuals found their cause in bringing new ideas to all of Europe. Literally, their lot in life, their meaning of life, was to share all these ideas with the rest of the world. These are these philosophes. Sort of what we think of as like teachers. Teachers to spread the knowledge to the world. Specifically Europe, of course. Europe, where most of these folks were. These philosophes used satire, double meanings to written word, novels, plays, dictionaries, books, productions they would do, things they would put out there. Now, why did they do this like this? They did this in many ways without basically just putting out like a scientific book, because by doing it through theater and plays and hidden meanings, comedy, they could get the ideas out there without being censored or attacked by the church, or the governments that were supported by the church, which were most governments. It's interesting. To avoid censorship as well, Montesquieu argued for a separation of powers in government. Strong intermediaries holding power to hold in check a tyrannical monarch. This was influential on our American Constitution. Montesquieu was incredibly influential. He argued for separation of powers, which is what we have in the United States government, 3 branches of government. And the purpose of it was to keep a powerful tyrannical emperor or leader in the executive branch of government from taking over. It's exactly what we created. Our Constitution in America created an incredibly weak executive branch. That's changed over the centuries. Voltaire wrote all kinds of works. He wrote works supporting England, scientific progress, religious tolerance. He became a rich aristocrat as a result of this. He advocated tolerance, believing that religion itself led to savage, inhuman actions. And he based this on how the actions of the Catholic and the Protestant churches over the previous centuries, and he's not wrong about that. Some of the greatest atrocities in European history were committed in the name of religion. Were committed in the name of Christian religion. It's just factual, the way it was. So he argued that we shouldn't have that. We shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. We shouldn't be like that. We see a little thing down here on the bottom, Montesquieu separation of powers. Each branch has the powers of the other branches. That's exactly what we have in our government. So I just wanted to point that out down there. It's exactly what we have. And we have Voltaire's quote down there at the bottom. Of all religions, the Christian should, of course, inspire the most tolerance. But until now, Christians have been the most intolerant of all men. The Enlightenment brought forth the Encyclopedia, 17-volume masterpiece, a summation of the new worldview of the Enlightenment. They examined the rapidly expanding whole of human knowledge. Probably the greatest intellectual masterpiece of the Enlightenment. The Principia was probably the greatest masterpiece of the scientific revolution, which happened right before this. That was the 15 to 1600s. And then the 16 to 1700s is the Enlightenment. The 17-volume had thousands of articles from every aspect of law, science, culture, society, government, you name it. But it's incredible. It's one of the greatest things ever written in Western, at least in the Western world history. One of the things that made it so cool was it included many, many parts that were not from Europe. There's many things in there of science and law from Asia, from the Arabic world, from the Muslim world, even from Northern Africa, Egypt, India. It is primarily European, don't get me wrong. It's like 80% European knowledge, but there's a lot of other things put in there of other people and other scientists and philosophers and religious scholars from other countries and other places that are also included, which makes it a really interesting multicultural masterpiece. It's quite interesting. Good. It's quite interesting stuff. All right, what else we have going on there? I think that's it for that page. All right. The Enlightenment continues. The Enlightenment across Europe. Adam Smith. Now, England and the Netherlands really led the way with the idea of tolerance, religious tolerance, and much of the scientific knowledge. Really, lots of countries are involved, but they were some of the countries that often led the way with this. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. If you've studied economics in any way, you're familiar with this. He believed in free enterprise. He believed in capitalism, which is basically the basis of America's economic system. Free enterprise, capitalism, basis for capitalistic economies. He argued the government should limit itself and not be involved in the business of society. This doesn't take into account a lot of modern issues, and it didn't take into account back then either. One thing Adam Smith really sort of glosses over in his writings is the peasant working class. Just sort of the assumption that the peasant working class will simply do the work without any real consideration for who they were and their difficulties of life, which is a huge flaw in his work. Now, as far as the economic aspects of his work, it's priceless. Every economics professor will discuss it and talk about it. And for that, it's priceless. But the actual sociological issues of it, it completely leaves out the aspects of the working and the poor, almost like they're not that significant. It's like looking at a machine and just worrying about the overall function of the machine and the output of the machine, and not really concerning yourself with all the small moving parts. Well, maybe you get the output you want if you give the input you want, but what if those little moving parts, what are those? You have pieces of metal in a machine, who gives a shit? But when all those little pieces and working parts are actual human lives, yeah, it kind of leaves that out. Completely leaves it out. Let's see what else we have going on here. Okay, Immanuel Kant. What is enlightenment? Immanuel Kant encouraged others to have the courage to use their own understanding when he published What is Enlightenment. He said all laws must be obeyed no matter what, but that laws should allow free-thinking, enlightened thinkers. All laws should be obeyed no matter what. However, laws should be just and should be able to evolve or change, and you should have free people deciding these laws. So while the one aspect might be a little extreme and severe, all laws must be obeyed no matter what. Even to the point of even minor laws having severe punishments, potentially. That is a flaw. But simultaneously, the idea that laws should be made by free-thinking, people of choice, there should be actual reason and logic put into laws. They shouldn't be emotional, shouldn't be religion governing laws. That is the most important thing to really take out of what Kant's teachings there. Urban culture and life in the public sphere. All right. Now, reading became a pastime by the 1700s in Europe, at least for the middle and upper classes. You were supposed to be well-read. You were supposed to read books. You were supposed to go to theater and plays. You were supposed to go to salons, which were basically where people sat around and talked about books, not where you got your hair done. And you were supposed to do all these things if you were someone who was cultured. Didn't mean you had to be rich, but this did cater to the middle and upper classes. It did. You were supposed to go out and converse, discuss, debate, go to public meetings, go to speeches. Now, while the more public stuff would sometimes involve the more lower classes, which was still the majority of people, most people were still illiterate, truthfully. So these big urban centers like Paris and London, places like that, which were well over 500,000 population by these 1500s. Paris and London, two of the largest cities in the world, although still small in comparison to some cities in Asia, but at least outside of Asia, huge cities. Well-read populations could converse, discuss these ideas, debates, go to public discussions, ideas that could often be exchanged in large cities because there were so many people. And these also are the largest cities that have ever existed in the Western world since the time of Rome, 1,000 years before. There had never been cities of 500,000 in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s. So for about 1,300 years, 1,200 years, we had not really had any cities of this size because Europe had gone through the Dark Ages, medieval ages, didn't have that kind of stuff. Public reading became more common, and sacred texts gave way to secular texts. Again, sacred is religious, and secular is non-religious. So previous to this time period, if you read something in the 1200s, it was most likely sacred, religious texts. The universities were run by the churches. But by the 1700s, that's changed. The universities have become largely secular. The texts and the reading and the books have become largely secular, much more so. Now that's out in the public. That's out in the public, which is accessible to most people of most classes. Now in the private, it was a little bit different. The private sphere was a lot more elite, a lot more hand-picked, typically just for the rich and wealthy. But the interesting thing in the private is, even though it was elite and more focused for really the upper classes, much more selective, it is actually the place where women could have some role. If women were part of wealthy families, upper-class families, they could get themselves into these places. We do see some women in universities. We see some women teachers, some women professionals. Again, a very small number. And they often ran these salons. These are social gatherings. They held in the drawing rooms. They held in their parlors. They held in their homes. They would meet and discuss literature. They would meet and discuss theater, plays, science, art, you name it. And this was one of the ways that upper-class women are able to have a more impactful and significant role in the Enlightenment period. The public was still almost exclusively male-dominated. Important issues we discussed in the public, discussions we held in spaces that were great for public gatherings, town halls, libraries, clubs, the public square, things like that. But again, almost exclusively male-dominated. All of it was really mostly male-dominated. But at least in the private, women did have some opportunities to actually express themselves and to learn. This is a salon, Enlightenment culture salon. You've got mostly men, but you do see a few women. It's actually hosted by a woman. If I remember right, it's actually hosted by her over here, the lady in the blue. She's actually the one hosting the whole thing. And what you have here most likely is a man probably reading a new play or something he wrote. And he's reading it for a select group of individuals in a salon environment before it goes out into the public and is actually put on stage somewhere to be presented to the general population. He's got this close select group of people which he'll read it to, he'll test it. It's like a test audience. He'll get input and et cetera, to see how it works. And you see how they're dressed. This is of the elite. This types of things. This is not common people. This isn't even middle-class clerks and things like that. This is for people who are often titled. They have names, families. They're as we're sometimes referred to in the time period, notables. People who are known, not regular folks like you, me, just regular people. They would be notable folks. So you see what kind of people you got here. Men and women, members, educated elite. They're actually reading a work by Voltaire, is what my note says. Voltaire wrote plays, theater plays, which often criticized government, often criticized and satirized the government and the church. But through a play environment, through a theater production, he was able to get away with that without basically getting his career ruined or killed or thrown in prison. You do see a few women here, women who could debate, reason, participate in this. And again, they're typically elite women who are probably part of elite families. That's why they're able to be here. Wealth, basically, above all else. If you've got the money, you can get away with lots of things, even issues of gender. Now, this is the public. This is France here, the public. French book trade image. All right. So we have a bookshop here. We have French people. And you have to think about what are they doing? Like, who are they? Why are they here? It's a bookshop. What kinds of books do they publish here? What type of status? This is a book in the trade area. So the question is, who can come in and buy a book? It's a public store. So you could have more middle class, even low class people could actually come in. Even workers, laborers could come in and buy a book if they were literate, which would not have been many. So you have customers. We have what might be a religious person. We have religious people in front, potentially. Priests, people who are part of the clergy. We have all kinds of books. You have all groups here in this image. You have the poorest, you have peasants, you have beggars, you have elite, you have in the back here, you have elite people in a carriage in front of what might be something special here, a museum or some type of government building. You have church figures, you have fancy women, and you have commoners, you have laborers, you have everything. And I think the idea of the image is to show how the books could actually bring different classes together. Education and knowledge could bring the poor, the middle, the upper classes, the nobility, the clergy. It could bring all these. Remember, this is France, where you have the different estates. You have the peasants and you have the clergy and nobility, the three estates. Knowledge, education could bring everyone together. All classes, all estates, all brought together at the same time through the use of knowledge and reason and books. Remember, mass printing is a new thing. Okay, it's not brand new. It's not like, brand new, but the idea of mass printing has still only been around for 200 years. There would definitely be people who would not own a book. There would be people who never read a book in this time period still. So it's interesting. Let's see what else you want to see. Or is there anything else here about the book? Really? What allows this to happen is, of course, the mass printing revolution, the printing press from the 1500s. And this is secular we're talking about. Most of this is secular reading. This is not religious reading. This is not religious sacred writings. These books, almost all these books printed by the late 1700s were secular, non-religious. Still the number one book being printed, as it still is today, the number one printed book in the world is the Bible in some form or another. But most of these things you'd find in these bookstores were not religious writings. That back in the back might be some type of a temple, classical look, sort of a Roman, Greek, classical look temple. And I think it's really significant. I think everything you show here, everything that is shown here in the painting, and you've probably heard the term, a picture tells 1,000 words. Artists would spend days, weeks, months, even occasionally years making paintings. Everything in the art is significant. Artists don't spend so much of their lifetime creating these works of art. Everything's significant. Every person, every image, every interaction, everything you see on the walls, the birds in the sky, they all have significance. They're all telling a message. 1,000 words, if you will. All right. Let's move on to the later Enlightenment. The late Enlightenment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Influential voice of the Enlightenment after 1770. He was dedicated to individualism. He criticized rationalism and civilization for destroying rather than liberating the individual. I'll say that again. He was dedicated to the idea of individualism, the individual having your own agency, your own power and authority, being able to take care of yourself, be successful, and be responsible for your own actions, the individual. He criticized rationalism. He criticized civilization. He believed it might actually destroy the individual rather than liberate the individual. Arguing that the loss of passion and caring passion and caring were being scienced out of society. and people had to actually be protected by from civilization. This is not an argument pro-religion. It's not. It's actually more of a humanist argument, really. It's not really a pro-religious or pro-sacred argument. It's really debating the nature of who has agency. Agency is sort of a term that be used to refer, like, where's the power and control in your life? Like if you're a prisoner in prison, you don't have any agency. You have no control over your life. That's an extreme example. But he argued that as a true individual, the only agency you should have is your own. You should have total control over yourself, your own life. What you do, who you are, what you read, where you live, what you learn, who you love. It's you. And he argued that the civilization and rationale and science basically created all these rules in society and built up and focused on civilization, government, and a structure, that society became so structured that he argued that we were moving away from the structure of the church, but we're moving right into another controlled structure of science, and would further strip away individualism. And this argument is actually further expanded in the coming years with industrialization. The idea that we are losing our individuality and our autonomy because of the industrialized society, technology, and machines. So this can be certainly expanded upon. It's an argument made by a lot of folks in later years in the 1800s with industrialization and, the idea that the individual is disappearing. So Rousseau is quoted by a lot of people in his time and after this time period. And he argues, finally, as I said, we need to actually find ways to protect the individual, to maintain our own agency from society around us. Some would take this to the extreme to actually withdraw from society, like the American sort of philosopher, literist, trying to think, is it Henry David Thoreau? The idea of pulling away, but that's a little divergent. That's digress. Don't worry about that. Another of Rousseau's controversial arguments was that since the female was passive in sexual relations, we won't even get into the modern issues of that, but the idea at the time was, the male was dominant, female's passive, the missionary position, man on top, woman on the bottom, that since it was thought the woman was passive in sexual relations, that she should also be passive in social life. She should be passive in public as well as private. Rousseau's views on gender, not really controversial at the time. A lot of people would have agreed with this. It would have been actually considered pretty acceptable by many. The idea of female sexual passivity, social passivity. He argued that women shouldn't be at salons, women shouldn't be out in the public, they should be in the private. They shouldn't, basically their job was to be at home taking care of the family. This is actually quite significant and quite influential, because this becomes actually sort of a standard idea, a trope. I'm not sure if trope is the right word, but that's the word that comes to mind. Sort of a standard in Western culture, all the way through modern times, that the woman should be more submissive, passive. It does actually sort of fall in line with religious teaching as well. That the woman has a place only in the private, taking care of the family, whether it's the husband, her son, her father, as sister, mother, daughter, wife, things like that. That's a woman's role and a woman's power. And the reality is most women did actually fall into that category. That's where most women were, the vast majority, almost all. And most women were taught that way. Therefore, most women stuck with that. And we see that as a recurring theme, at least in Western culture, all the way to modern times. Interesting. Now, maybe the best part of Rousseau, because Rousseau, a lot of controversial stuff with Rousseau. However, it needs to be clear, he is one of the most influential philosophers on Western culture, American culture, Western European culture. Even though some of the stuff is very, very controversial, it turned a lot of minds. A lot of people really bought into and believed and agreed with Rousseau. However, all that being controversial, there's one thing that actually came out of it which is actually very interesting and important to our society and our government, especially the social contract. His idea of the social contract reflected the idea that the common interest of all people was the general will. The common interest of all people was the general will of the people, and this general will should actually replace the power of the monarch, which was a term we would refer to as popular sovereignty. That all power shouldn't rest in the hands of the crown. Power should actually rest in the hands of the people. That is the basis of the American Constitution, the social contract. The idea that the power in our society should not rest with the government or the monarch at the top, the king, president. Power of our society should actually rest with the people. The power of our government should rest with the people. And it's a contract. It's a social contract we make. In essence, we agree to support the ruler if the ruler supports us and takes care of us fairly and justly. That's the social contract. And conversely, when the ruler does not take care of the people and does not support the people, protect the people are no longer contractually obligated to follow the ruler. Therefore, it is okay to rebel, to have revolution, to overthrow a government or society that is not just and takes care of the people. The social contract. That is maybe the most key tenet of our entire American governmental structure. That may be hard to see in our society today, but that is really the building block of the American Constitution. It's really interesting. So even though a lot of Rousseau's stuff is shit, female passivity stuff, and a lot of his stuff is really, take it or leave it, the social contract is instrumental to what it is to be an American, actually. All these folks, heavily influential on our founding fathers. Remember, our founding fathers were all elite. They were almost all wealthy, all elite, all educated. Most of them were lawyers, doctors, ministers. Of course, a lot of them slave owners as well. They were the elite. They were the middle and upper classes and upper middle class. They would have all read this stuff. They would have all been to salons. They would have all been to public readings. They would have all sat around with their other educated friends, our founding fathers, and read all this stuff. All of them would have been familiar with people like Rousseau or John Locke. So these are the men who wrote our Constitution. As imperfect as American society was, I'll just leave it with this. There's a quote, and I don't remember who says the quote. I think it's a modern time. I think it's... I can't remember who does the quote off the top of my head. And I'm paraphrasing it. And it amounts to this. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. Our society is far from perfect. It's very imperfect. But it's better than anything else out there. All right. Let's see what's going on. What's next? The growth of consumerism. We're shifting gears a little bit. We're actually at the end here. It's going to be a shorter video. We're almost done with this one, actually. So the growth of consumerism, the Atlantic world. This new and diverse Atlantic trade system involved many countries, many goods, raw materials, including, of course, slaves and slavery. This helped create new identities, ideas that never existed before. In essence, the cross-global interactions creates all kinds of new things that had never existed before. In many cases, people never imagined. Economic, social situations that people could have never come up with. It creates a whole new world. And we're not just talking about the Americas as the new world. It creates a whole new globe of interactions, societies, economic situations, political situations that no one could have ever imagined before. Some good, some bad. Absolutely. We see all these explorations. We see all kinds of new perspectives regarding race, society, government, etc. All right. Thus, consumer culture. This consumer culture, as it became known, is really only evident in large cities. Large cities in Europe, and we do see it in the colonies. Large cities, of course, are the consumers of all these new materials and goods, and the colonies are the producers of all these new materials and goods. So this creates a new consumer culture of colonies, providing everything that then is then consumed and used and manufactured in the cities. The large cities, basically the Americas and Asia, other parts of the world, providing everything that goes to Europe to fuel the daily life of Europe. Only a few dozen cities. A few dozen cities consumed the products of the entire globe for a couple centuries, basically. All right. It begins with agriculture. Population growth in agriculture. We see improvements in agriculture, agricultural improvements. We see improved diets, nutrition through Europe. What that does is create a massive population boom after the medieval ages, after the Black Deaths of the 13, 14, 1500s, the diseases of bubonic plagues, the wars we talked about in the previous chapter. All that stuff, simply put, decimated Europe. Decimated Europe. 30, 40% population declines in areas, just massive. Entire regions almost depopulated as a result of wars and disease and famine. Entire regions that had hundreds of thousands of people, almost all of it gone. Well, the Little Ice Age ended. Massive global trade, bringing all kinds of new products, diets, food, new calories, new things, and medicines. And we see a massive population boom in the time period we're talking about here of the scientific and Enlightenment period. We see this massive population boom. All right, another thing which happens, which is highly influential, is the enclosure system. The enclosure system introduces privately owned property and privately owned agricultural fields. Previous to this, most agriculture was communal. There wasn't quote-unquote private farms. Most people worked for the community. They produced food and products for their community, their town, their region, their county. There might have been a central authority of a king or a prince or something, but most people didn't produce things just for themselves. Well, the enclosure system changes that, and we see the idea of privately owned land, privately owned wealth, and once it's decided private ownership, most of it falls into the hands of the rich and wealthy. And then all the people who are working on the land basically become connected to the land, and all these people are sort of now under the purview of this landowner who owns all this land, which generates a massive amount of wealth. We see contained livestock. We see improvements in livestock and breeding of livestock. We see a massive growth of livestock, cows and pigs and chickens, things like this. We see selective breeding to ensure we have the best lines of meat and products and food. We see a several time increase in the productivity of food and meat production, which of course all that goes into the population. We see the population boom dramatically. Increasing yields of meat and crops, new growing techniques, new types of vegetables. All this leads to a massive explosion of European population from the 17 to 1800s. So massive that we see from 1700 to 1800, Europe's population triples. The entire continent's population triples. Huge. And what do all those people get to do? They get to start working. And more people produce more kids. More people work in the farms. You're producing more food. And more food allows more growth. It's a cycle. More people, more food, more growth allows you to have more food and more population, more growth. And if you're in a contained environment, that can only go so far. Just Europe. But the thing is, it was no longer contained. They now had the ability to pull in products and goods and food and produce and livestock and agriculture and vegetables and everything globally. So it was no longer contained. Literally, there was no actual cap. The population could have just grown exponentially for decades and just grown and grown and grown, which it did. Now, another huge part of this consumer revolution was the prices of everything dropped because it's supply and demand. The greater the supply, the cheaper the goods are. Greater supply, cheaper goods. Therefore, there's this massive supply of goods, products, clothing, which means people bought more clothes, had access to more clothes. Clothes were cheaper. This is also part of this culture. Prices were lower because of mass production. Now, there's no quote-unquote factories or assembly lines, nothing like that yet. But we do see, because we do have so many people working now to produce goods around the world, we basically have mass production goods, we have cheap products being shipped in from around the globe. We see a massive increase in the workforce and a massive increase in women in the workforce. Cheap paid. I mean, yeah, they're making dirt pay, but they're still getting paid, and we see a huge population boom of the actual workforce, the labor force. Some countries like Europe already had millions. Some countries like England already had millions of people by the 1700s in the labor force. Millions of people working in labor, working in factories, working on farms, working in plants, things like this. Millions of poor laborers producing all these goods. And then you have the colonial economies produce cottons and vegetables and fruits and you name it. And it should be noted, if I have it on the slide here, a lot of that labor was actually slave labor. A lot of that labor, not in Europe. Europe had little to no slavery. It existed, but 99% of the workforce in Europe was paid laborers, white laborers. Slavery never took hold in Europe. It's ironic when you consider that who were the ones actually plying the global slave trade, actually running the global slave trade, the ones actually taking the slaves out of Africa, sending them across the world, were the Europeans. The English and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch, they were the ones doing it. That may show up on the video. That's okay. No big deal. And they were the ones doing all this. But the slavery never really took hold in Europe. They went to and got the slaves in Africa and then took them around the world, but not many actually made it to a European population, and there's a reason for that. We haven't got into it yet, and we will talk about this. I mean, slavery happened because there was a need for it. There was a demand. There was a supply of Africans in Africa that could not defend themselves and protect themselves, and they were abducted and stolen and kidnapped, forced labor, and there was a massive demand for them in the New World. There was no demand for that in Europe. There was millions upon millions of laborers in Europe looking for work. Had the indigenous Native Americans not died out, 99% population decline, 95%, basically 19 of every 20 Native Americans died. Had that not happened, there would have been a much lower demand for slave labor in the Americas because, well, as many Spanish and Portuguese did, they basically enslaved the Indians. And then they died. The Africans didn't. So, but much of these goods were produced by the slave labor in the world, the Americas and other places. What else we have want to put in here? Urban areas offered cramped living quarters. Living was rough. Living was tight. Really small places. High rent, space was at a premium. However, by the end of the 1700s, even poor households could have domestic accessories, cutlery and dishes and beds and glass and, wow, even windows. Bear in mind the idea of glass windows is a relatively new thing in world history. Most places in the world had windows, but there was no glass. I mean, there was nothing there. It was just an open window. Before this, people slept on the floor. Yeah, I mean, so you have all kinds of new technologies and access to all these goods that you didn't have before. Stuff that, people didn't have access to before, and now you do. Now, most of this is taking place in large cities, and these large cities also include large industrial zones, because you've got all these workers. Again, England alone had 2.5 million workers in this time period. They got to work. And they work in factories, they work in industrial areas, employment, working class, low-paying jobs. But even a low-paying job offered purchasing power that never existed before. If you were a peasant or a serf, you had no money. you should understand that if you were a peasant or a serf working on a farm, you didn't have money. You didn't. You literally just survived on what you produced on that farm, or what was given to you by your landlord, your owner, your king, your prince, whoever, the aristocrat that you were under. You didn't really have money. You didn't really earn money. Even the poorest working class people now in the cities actually earn money. They have money in their pockets every single day to go buy clothes, buy food, buy alcohol, to buy something in the store, to buy a pretty something. So even the poorest people have a purchasing power and ability to buy things that literally no one ever had before. So it's really quite interesting. Even a little bit of money is incredibly more than zero money. Mass production lowers the prices of goods. The cost of goods is really cheap. More people could purchase more stuff. Greater amount of merchandise paves the way for the consumer revolution, which is really something more of an 1800s thing, the consumer revolution. We'll talk more about in later chapters. It really changes everything, changes the world. For the better for many things, of course, for the worse for some people. But what can't be argued is it changes everything. Consumerism in the Atlantic world, the triangle trade. Excuse me. All right. So while the Atlantic was linked to the Indian, so we have the Atlantic here linked to the Indian Ocean, which is way over here. And of course, we have the Pacific Ocean over here. We had trade routes all across the world by the 1800s. This goes up to, what, 1760? So by 1760, we had trade routes everywhere. They were global. All this started back in the 1400s. So by the 1700s, we have established global trade routes to all parts of the world. The biggest ones, the ones that were the most profitable, was the triangle trade. Between Africa, that's the triangle, Europe, and the Americas. So it's a triangle on its side, if you will. But between Africa, Europe, and the Americas, a triangle trade. Anything and everything, from goods to clothes to natural resources to raw materials to manufactured goods to people, were part of this triangle trade system between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This was this special system, this special trade system. Now, the ones that began the system were the Spanish and the Portuguese, but the ones that really maintained the system in the basically 17 to 1800s was the British. By the mid-1700s, the uncontested global dominating empire was the British. It simply was. They were the global dominant empire by the mid-1700s. Hands down, uncontestable. They had their fingers in every continent, every part of the world. They had colonies and facilities on every continent globally. And they had the largest navy in the entire world. By some accounts, the British alone had more ships than everyone else combined. Every other country in the world, the British had more ships than all the others together. They were the uncontested masters of the world. Makes it even more surprising that we managed to actually win the revolution. Really, we shouldn't have won that revolution. It was pure chance and luck that we managed to actually throw off the British dominance. So, England maintaining these colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas, North America especially. This exchange of goods became this major business venture known as the triangle trade. Now, the most basic part of this is, it's an incredibly constantly moving picture, but to keep it at its most simple, raw materials from the Americas were transferred to Europe. Manufactured goods from Europe went to Africa to be traded for slaves, to go back to America, to be put on the plantations to make more raw materials. And the cycle continues. Raw materials, manufactured goods, slaves. Now again, there's 100 other pieces to this. Those are just the big three parts of it, the big 3 points. This was, by 1800, the most profitable venture for England and France and Spain, And as I said, England was the most dominant power, and this triangle trade alone was probably accounted for half of the entire economic revenue of countries like England and France. Half of their entire economy was simply tied up in this triangle trade system of these countries like England, France, maybe even Spain. Completely separate of everything else being built and produced in their own countries. France was also involved in this as well. Their Caribbean colonies, including Saint Domingue, the most profitable sugar and coffee plantation in the New World. The most valuable raw materials being produced in the New World were sugar and coffee, worth their weight in gold. Again, that's a term I've used before. It's just not. It's not hyperbole. It's literally these things would be traded pound for pound with bags of gold. Sugar and coffee, things like this. And tobacco as well, which I'm not talking about that right here, but tobacco coming from the northern colonies will become the American colonies. Yeah. It's not an exaggeration that they would be traded for with the equivalent or near equivalent traded in actual gold weight. Or silver weight, sometimes silver. They'd use silver as well. Silver was much more plentiful than gold. There was 10 times more silver in the world economy than gold. Spain was also a big part of this. While Spain had been declining for, the better part of 100, 150 years, and England and France were on the rise, Spain was still a big part of this. Still colonies in the Americas, Louisiana Territory in North America. Quite interesting. These were the big players in this triangle trade system. Louisiana Territory. All right. And this is sort of an extended trade system. This shows it going beyond just the Europe, Africa, and the colonies. It shows it going into South America. It shows it going all the way up into the Arctic, going around the other side of the world. This is actually a view of the world from the top. So you see the actual system going on the other side of America, across the Pacific Ocean, over to Asia, over towards what, would be like modern day, China, that direction. It's a weirdly distorted map. It's really weird. I hate this map. It basically takes the entire world and puts it on a little small spot on a huge globe. It'd be like taking a globe of the world and having one little 3-inch spot being all the continents on an entire globe. It's so out of proportion. But anyway, the idea is it gives you an idea of the trade actually going. It's global. Yes, the triangle trade was the most profitable part of it, but the trade system went over to India, to China, Southeast Asia, to Southern Africa. It was global by the late 1700s. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about is race. All right. Now, one of the ways that white Europeans really came to terms with all these interactions with people of different races and colors was to sort of try to understand their role in the world. Because the reality is, most of the world was not white. Most of the world is not white. And Europeans were the ones that were basically controlling the world's economy, and everyone they interacted with, everyone who wasn't European was not white. And also, almost none of them were Christian. So we're dealing with people who are not Christian, don't speak European languages, don't look the same, everything different. And Europeans had to sort of rationalize and try to understand this. For most Europeans, they didn't even understand. It didn't make sense to them, the logic of all these people that didn't speak their languages, didn't look like them, didn't worship like them. It was difficult for a lot of folks in Europe to come to terms with. And they tried to understand this through science, because again, this is the scientific revolution. So to see something different than you, and you want to understand it, you want to explain it, well, since the prevailing method is scientific experimentation and scientific logic and reason, that made sense. That's logical. So we're going to use science to explain the differences between us and Africans, between us and South Americans, between us and Chinese. Let's try to use science to understand it. That makes sense. That is logical. Here's the problem. When they really try to do this, it goes off the fucking rails. It's bad. It's really bad. It becomes the whole understanding of human race becomes a pseudoscience, between sort of a fake science, a half science. There's some scientific principles there that make sense, but a lot of it is just garbage. To understand the different races, colors, and things. All right, so Kant, on the different races of man, he claims that there were 4 different races, all of which descended from the original species. And the original species is the white brunette people. That's the original species. Interestingly enough, that's the Western Europeans. White brunette. Okay, that's most of the people who were involved in international colonization. The French, the British, the Spanish, white brunette. Interestingly enough, that must be the head, that must be the original of all races. Other skin colors devolved, and devolve is the word they use. Not evolve, but devolve, actually devolved from the original white race due to climate and geography. Finally, this idea of race was used to designate biologically different groups of people, even though the word really has no meaning. I mean, I'm sure everyone understands race actually means nothing scientifically. It's not a science word. It's a cultural word. It's a sociological word. Race actually has no significance. We're all human. We're all genetically the same as humans. Our skin color is solely due to one thing. Climate. Geography. Climate and geography combined, I guess, if you want to put it that way. That's the difference in skin color. The races of the world are different because of climate and geography. It's got zero to do with genetics. There's no genetic differences. So race is actually meaningless. We're all the same species. But people use this idea of race to differentiate different biologically different appearing. It's all about appearance of humans. Is that how's that in genetics? Is that phenotype? Don't quote me on that, but is that right? Phenotype? Basically the different appearance of something. Even though there's actual scientific differences. This new classification system placed whites on top, blacks on the bottom, of course. And of course this would be used as a justification for what? Do I have it on here? I don't have it specifically, but this of course was used as a justification for slavery. Whites on the top, and as skin colors changed and went down, and of course the bottom were blacks. You see a figure here. Classes of intelligence. With the typical white-looking brunette, apparently a balding guy too, here at the front, going down to a more black image here of a black face or black look. This being the top of the hierarchy and black being the bottom of the hierarchy. This is how it was written about. And this became, and this is the kicker, this became accepted scientific fact. It's not fact, but it became accepted as scientific fact for centuries. This became the standard for white supremacy globally, white dominance globally, the idea that whites were at the top genetically, culturally, civilization-wise, and everyone else was less than. White superiority. Now, that doesn't mean everyone bought into it, but it needs to be clear the mass majority of Europeans and Americans bought into this hook, line, and sinker. Some argued against it. For instance, a Scottish philosopher, James Beattie, did argue against it. He argued that in Americas, Asia, and Africa, non-European high levels of civilization did exist. And of course they did. We see levels of civilization in Mesoamerica, in Southern Africa, of course China, Chinese civilization, which was more advanced than any civilization in the world for centuries. The Egyptians, black African Egyptians, had the most advanced civilization of the ancient world, mathematically. Mathematical and scientific knowledge of the ancient Egyptians that wasn't matched by the Europeans for millennia. So people did argue that, you know what, these ancient civilizations, these peoples from Africa, Asia, the Middle America, had advanced civilizations while Europeans were basically sleeping in cow and pig shit, and were, lucky to build fires. But yet, Europeans didn't really care. All they really looked at was the fact that right now, we're advanced, they're not. Whatever happened 1,000 years ago, not our problem. We don't care. Even though the reality is much different. Ultimately, though, we see a lot of scientists arguing more for than against these stereotypes. We see most natural philosophers, scientists, arguing more for it than against it. The majority. Rousseau, for instance, he argued that women were weaker, naturally passive, inferior to men, and, that we should have male superiority, specifically white male superiority. This becomes a ruling sociological issue for Western society, American society, European society, all the way to modern times. This idea of white male superiority. It is still ingrained in our culture. It's still here. Let's see, North America, South America, plantation zones. This shows you the big plantation zones, the dark green areas. Brazil, East Coast here, East Coast, Mesoamerica, Middle America, the Caribbean, all same thing. And of course, North America. You have the French here as part of New France. And then of course you have the British colonies here. Big areas for plantations and of course slaves. Slaves were the #1 producers of goods in the Americas. In the 1600s, it was Native Americans, indigenous American populations, Indians. But by the late 1700s, the #1 producer of products and goods in the Americas were African slaves. Modern society, Western society, and this is really it really can't be argued. It's really factual. The world of the industrial world of the 1900s was built on the backs of slaves. It just was. This is the part where I'd, of course, be asking if there are questions or anything, but that's really it for the chapter. I hope you learned something here. Hope something was useful to you, and we will see you next time.